and we were wanting each group to share one key idea on their slide. Now, you're very lucky that Dr. Gerard Princeton isn't marking these, because if he was, he would say that if you went over, if you gave us more than one idea, he would stop reading at that point and would not give you any marks for that. But we're far more open in the DevNet and this DevNet Symposium, and we're all here to share ideas and learn. So as long as we've got time to get through all the ideas, we will do so. So, going first to the Christchurch Hub, or Tutahi, thanks guys for the ideas you've brought in. So we're wondering if this is even possible, if ethics is even possible, unless you had previous genuine relationships to build on. So the issue of relationships and how that relates to participatory research and doing it ethically was raised by the Christchurch Hub group. So some of you might be coming up with ideas that are about how we can go ahead and do things. Some of you might be raising more ideas you had about questions that we need to continually reflect on as we're thinking about research in the post-pandemic phase. So that's a really good one, a really important one, and it links in with what Tassasius was saying to us too about the importance of relationships as a foundation of all good development research. And just so that you keep this in mind, there will be time for a bit of broader discussion around this. I'd like to present the ideas. If there's the facilitator of any group feels that I'm not quite capturing the idea, or there's something that you wanted to particularly elaborate on, feel free to unmute yourself and just let us know. That's not a problem, okay? Facilitators, just be really aware of that. And also, it brings in the broader question of what would happen if this type of research is continuing in a post-COVID-19 no travel environment because of a climate change world. And that's absolutely right. The pandemic has been the current crisis. Most people will be aware that there are continual shocks and challenges in the world generally, but that can particularly afflict countries that might be in more vulnerable positions to climate change when we're looking at Pacific Ocean, of course. So that's a good issue as well that's been raised by the Christchurch Hub. Just going to move on to the next one. So like I say, jot down questions, jot down responses. We're going to open this up to broader discussion shortly. But the facilitators do chip in if there's something you particularly want to elaborate upon. The Dunedin Hub noted about the disruption for field-based researchers, how they've responded by trying to pursue locally based research and build new networks, including with non-university institutions. However, that can't be done quickly because those relationships take time. We're coming back to relationships and the need for time again. Critical issues that were brought up, of course, by Tassasius. And but I really like that point that you've raised there about the new networks, including non-university institutions. If someone from the Dunedin Hub wants to give an example of that, fantastic. But we'll just get to your last 2 points. Pursuing non-traditional methods, internet-based, for example, using social media more, photo voice research, including in our field schools. Again, it'd be interesting to hear about what are these field schools? How are field schools still taking place during a pandemic? Has Otago been doing online field schools? And careful ethics and how they're tricky in this environment. That keeps coming up, doesn't it? So, yeah, some really great points. And Tassasius, it's great having you with us again for this session too. And I hope we might, when we open it up more generally beyond the facilitators, it might be nice to go to you first to see if you have any particular responses to any of these points that have been raised by the breakout rooms. Does the Dunedin facilitator want to make any comment on the field schools or on the working with non-university institutions? Give an example.
Hey Regina, it's Doug here. some examples of the non-university institutions might be, for example, I've started to do a couple of summer scholarships, which are typically just based on university collaborations in different parts of the world with SID and with VSA. So trying to use the research skills in ways that help strengthen their capacity rather than pursuing individual research. I'm sure the other people in the hub will have other examples, but I'm aware that we have 14 slides to get through. In terms of the field school based stuff, yeah, it's been really tricky, but we've been trying to do sort of hybrid examples where some of it is small site visits, some of them are being done by connecting with different stakeholders in different parts of the country via Zoom, or drawing on previous data sets of various kinds, qualitative and quantitative, from previous field schools, and then getting the students to interrogate those, and so teaching research methodology in that kind of way. But I wouldn't say that this is something which is a great leap forward, you know, it's kind of a strategy which we've pursued because that's what we have to do, not because we really want to.
Thanks, Doug. Very, very interesting. Some cool adaptations there. And it's just making me think too about the virtual field schools, about the virtual tourism space. So some of you might be aware that some of us here are tourism researchers, a number of small enterprises managed to do okay despite border closures by opening up to virtual tours and virtual tourists. And for example, those of you from Aotearoa will be aware of the fact that the mighty Manawatu, where Palmerston North is based, is not known as a hub for tourism. But there's a guy with a small farm in not far from Massey University who has been hosting hundreds of virtual tourists for 1 hour tours of his farm, earning some really good money from that. And there are people sometimes from big companies in the US or people just based in countries and cities where they're locked down and want an experience of some greenery, and all they know that it's a New Zealand farm and they want to have a look around, and there's some colourful, interesting animals, so they do it that way. So maybe the virtual field schools are a good way of addressing the climate change issue as well, and working in partnership with others in the future. So that's great, thanks Dunedin. So we'll move on to the next one. We've got Lorena's group here, the researcher group 1. Are we going back to that? Mm-hmm. Sorry. Great, and there are 2 points. There's a need to pause and accept that we cannot do things in the same way, not forcing it in ways that will damage relationships. Fabulous again, Tassa says you'll be, I'm sure, nodding away here, not forcing things, using the pause as a time to reflect and think about those relationships. Also, moving through the change in ways that are respectful, ethical, careful, and effective to researchers, practitioners, and to the communities we engage with, importantly. So perhaps thinking about elevating the importance of those communities. Through flexibility, adaptability, creativity, and doing things in a non-traditional manner. Lorena, if there was one particular idea that came forward about those ideas, about how to implement that, feel free to share that.
I think that in a way it was, it raised more questions than answers for a lot of us. There was a group of both practitioners and researchers, including the wonderful group in Dunedin, in Otago. So from all of that, we also agreed with the Otago Hub about the careful relationships and pausing, knowing that it's massively disruptive for all of our work and our research, but finding another wonderful practitioner giving us the idea of flexibility, adaptability, creativity in collaboration with those that we are researching alongside with. So finding new methodologies of research and development that are created together with those communities we are researching with. So a few questions that hopefully we will answer at the end of today. Maybe.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lorena, and all of those who participated in that group. And it's going to be interesting to see if we get some differences coming through from the postgraduates where there are more time pressures in terms of what they are trying to achieve. Fabulous. So researcher group 2 was then led by Jessie. And so Jessie Hesse-Graham is based at Auckland University, and the note that students have different needs and constraints, limited time, scholarship demands, etc., than established researchers who already have relationships. So that point then coming through, it's harder to wait. Importance of time. Different population groups have different facility with social media tools by age, for instance, right? Absolutely. Api and I are working with researchers who are implementing a survey in the Pacific at the moment on looking at well-being of communities prior to the return of tourism. That's a researcher-administered survey for people who are younger. They're happy filling that in themselves on a smartphone or on a tablet. But for older members of communities, they need the researcher to directly assist and fill things in for them. That's just one example. So, and that's that the researcher is then influencing the research more in those cases rather than getting completely independent, potentially, answers. Okay, and then collaboration. The pandemic gives the opportunity to empower and hand over ownership of research to partners. So decentralizing the research. But there are institutional constraints, and then the issue of how to avoid bias. Jessie, I don't know if you wanted to give one example of something linked to a point that was made, such as the institutional constraints or how to decenter the research or hand over ownership.
I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to fully distill to a main idea or two, but the idea is that in our experience working with partners, you have to come up with creative ways to outsource your funds, and you know you can sometimes come up against unexpected barriers either from your own host, your own institution, or the institution that you're partnering with in order to get transfer of funds so that your partners can properly do research, have ownership over it instead of just being a contracted research assistant. This is forcing us, whether we like it or not, to accelerate those decentralizing and decolonizing approaches that we talk about a lot, but find difficult to implement, and this has forced us to do that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Jessie. It's making me think about that many of us work in sort of quite large bureaucratic types of institutions in a sense, and they can sometimes be quite unflexible. And so when we are trying to do things like adapt our research practice and divert funds to things that Tarcisius was mentioning, like, well, actually, the most important thing is that we provide all our research participants with a $50 card for Wi-Fi access or something like that. They might, we actually need at a time like this to be able to work in ways that are responsive to what our partners and what our participants need. But sometimes we've got predetermined allocated funds and outputs that are supposed to be associated with them, and that's not always helpful. So thanks very much for all of your research group and to all of your group and their ideas. Researcher group, so we're going to policy practitioner group 1 now, and Will is our facilitator, and Will has decided to give us an oral presentation by the looks of things.
Regina, the oral presentation is not intentional. I have typed something out, but it hasn't come through. So could you go to the other groups and loop back to me, and I'll see if it'll be filled out in a couple of minutes. Not a problem. Thanks, Will.
Okay, and it might be the case with a couple of you, because maybe once we start sharing, we're not. I think that's probably the issue. Once we start sharing the presentation, you might continue typing into the shared document, but we've got a different one that's up. But in any case, so the same issue might have arisen for Philippa, but are you happy to talk to it, Philippa, or do you want me to come back to you?
Yeah, I did type it in time. I don't know why it hasn't come up. I had done it before we came back. So I think, yeah, there seems to be a few, yeah, maybe refresh it.
You might have to, yes, yeah, sorry. You might need to stop the share in some ways and, yeah, or at least stop might have to stop the.
Well, I can, while you're doing that, I can say, so ours was quite, I tried to make it quite short. And so I just said that what it taught us was to think long term about how we, meaning us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, can be sustainable and work in partnership towards the decentralisation and the localisation of the creation of knowledge. So again, picking up on some things that have already been discussed around, yeah, partnership and decentralisation and localisation, trying to smush it all into one.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant, as you'll see, and that's brilliant. Thank you, Sue-Ann, for refreshing that, so we can see it now. But it's actually really great when we're getting some strong alignment with some of the themes that are coming through. And by the way, as a little innovation, Fong put down the end of the presenter something that, what is it though? Little, no, you removed it. Oh, okay. There was going to be a sharing of key terms or something like that, but we're not quite doing that now. Okay, we'll go back to Will's group now. Oh, yeah, that's okay. Okay, great. So, Will, are you happy to, you might...
It's a little... Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's not a problem, Sue-Ann. I'll just read these out and then, Will, you might have something particular to share. So, building on Tassis' idea of waiting for knowledge, Cook Islands government yesterday released a development strategy that takes a 100-year view, and how great that we have Valerie as our next keynote, because she's going to be very aware of what's going on with this. It's been part of all the planning in the Cook Islands. So focusing on intergenerational progress helps us to slow down rather than those shorter timeframes that have often prescribed a lot of what goes on in the development policy and practice, or the development practice space in particular. And then the Mindanao Young Leaders Program. So it's Philippines. Researchers realised that even in the most difficult periods of the pandemic, when face-to-face contact was impossible, they still needed to find a way to remain connected to strengthen the relationship for when research could resume. Cool. That's great. So, Will, is there anything you'd like to share to build on that? Because what way did they find to remain connected in Mindanao?
Regina, I'll actually give the option, if they'd like to speak to it, to either Jal or Jilin, if you want to jump in and speak to that, because they know the detail obviously much better than I do.
Jal, do you want to do? We can see you on our screen, so that's why we're calling your name out. Would you like to elaborate?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, assalamualaikum, a peaceful afternoon there in New Zealand, and good morning, everyone. We actually covered a lot of things, but I just want to, highlight some key points that is very vital in the discussion. We identified that COVID-19 is really a great barrier in terms of most specifically in developing countries. And we also shared our experiences when we are conducting our own research, because in the Mindanao Young Leaders, we're now in the stage where we are doing a research project, and some people like me are first-time researchers, and it's really hard to do it online, considering that these communities that we serve do not have access to internet. Our key informants, our data that we need is in the community, but how can we get it if the main barrier to getting the information is internet? So we actually identified some tips on how we will be able to push through with our research with effective ways, and some key points mentioned during discussion are thinking about Like, for example, in my case, I actually was able to find out that there are ways on how I'll be able to reach out my key informants, and that is through seeing the spirit of Katitinabanga. I mentioned about how Mranaos, my target community, values the spirit of Katitinabanga. So in a way, if you can reach them through formal communication like emails, and other communication, you can actually tap a friend or tap a relative. In that way, the sense of Katitinabanga would flourish, and they would feel more sense of responsibility to kind of respond to you. And that's kind of very beautiful aspect of cultural consideration. And another point was made is on having a local views on the community that you are serving per se, and building collaboration with the potential partners that could help you. And yeah, I think that's it for me. And maybe Geraldine would like to add something.
We might need to leave time to go through the other group's points, but that was, if that's okay, but that was really helpful, Jal, elaborating on that. So thanks so much. Cool to hear about it, and thanks for participating today. So we'll go to group 3 then, the policies and practitioners, and that was facilitated by Angela. And this group found that Indigenous-led approaches to research that have been strengthened through the pandemic must remain empowered and enabled once borders open up. And Angela, it could be good if you could give us an example of one of those Indigenous-led approaches in a moment, if you have one. And people living in the context are best placed to do the research. Ask the questions and ask the right people. They're the best placed, right? And this needs to be incentivized, right? We can't just expect them to do this, and coordinated through the power-laden development ecosystem. Awesome. So again, easy for me to reflect on the fact that I could be seen as having quite a bit of power as a researcher, and how can I incentivize those in context to do the research, ask the questions and ask the right people. How do I support that? It might be harder for postgraduate students, might be harder for some others among you as well. But yeah, Angela, is there one point you'd like to make in relation to that?
Kia ora, thank you, Regina. No, I think you've summarised it well. Just on your previous point around remaining empowered once borders open up, I think we have to recognise that there's the risk that we go back to our old normal, and the significance. I mean, we know here in New Zealand that borders will be opening up come January, February, April. That might change things. So taking it beyond the rhetoric that sounds good to actually meaningful change, I think, is the next stage of this conversation. Victoria raised this point. I just want to give her the chance to, I know you're running out of time.
I think that's fine, Angela. I think that sums it up really well. Thanks, Angela and Regina.
Thanks, Victoria. Cheers, Angela. That's great. Some very good points there that are coming out. And then are we, Sarah's group? We're moving to Sarah's policy practitioner group, and after that, is it the postgrad groups? Or is it, yes, is that correct? Okay, fantastic. Just trying to keep an eye on the time here. So we've got about 5 minutes before we finish this session, and then we will be taking a break for 20 minutes before we come back for Valerie's keynote. So I'm just making you aware of that. Feel free to write things into the chat if you've got responses, if you've got questions for others, and so forth. And remember, you can direct message others, but you can also send points to the whole group. So Sarah's group have their key reflections come through as the importance of working ethically, not to rush. How we go about research is important, respecting cultural differences, working collaboratively, including local communities, finding ways to connect when that was previously done face-to-face, understanding that populations are under stress during research in COVID times. Now, Sarah, if there's one example of any of those things that somebody shared in your group and you'd like to pass that on, go for it, because they're all really good points. Like, for example, how do we find ways to connect that are not face-to-face, but that feel good for everyone. So off you go, Sarah.
Kia ora, thanks, Regina. And actually, Malaya has agreed to share a reflection at this point. So over to you, Malaya.
Awesome.
Thank you, Sarah. I think one of the key challenges in contexts like Mindanao is the connectivity. And in times of pandemic and online engagement, it's really hard to connect with communities, especially in the grassroots level. So some researchers here find ways, creative ways, in maximizing established and previous relationship, even throughout pandemic through online. And some researchers also have experience of conducting interviews through phone calls, where with communities that don't have access to internet and Zoom and etc. And also connecting with local leaders and local personalities to ensure that we have to ensure and maintain relationship even at the time of social distancing. And another reflection from our group is taking also this time to reflect, taking the pause and reflect on our process in as a practitioners and researchers in development.
Great, thanks so much, Malaya. And I have heard from other partners too, such as those in the Pacific, that it's been a little bit of a breath of fresh air, not having their partners from like New Zealand and Australia visiting with them quite so often, just for a bit of a pause from the busyness of things. Like many of us have, if we've appreciated anything, have appreciated a bit of time for pause. Okay, we're going to go to the postgrad groups now, and Tracy's at AUT. She facilitated this first one, opportunities to do research in new ways, in new contexts, and create new types of relationships where there are more local voices coming through and there's more capacity building. That's an interesting one. Capacity building hasn't come through in the same way and the other ones so far. So how are we building that capacity among our local researchers? And the challenges of building relationships via distance, socio-cultural and infrastructural, and challenges even if in the field, for example, distrust and COVID. Yes, tricky. And this amplifies the usual postgrad pressures to do with time, resources, etc. Resources isn't written there, but I'm very aware of that. Tracy, we're getting a little short on time, and I'm going to make sure the postgrad groups go first after in the second part of today. But if there is one example you'd like to share, go for it.
No, I think I'll just leave it at that so the other groups have an opportunity for their slides to be shown as well.
Thanks, Tracy. That's awesome. And Godi, who's living in the Waikato, has facilitated second postgrad group. They talked about relationship building that's come through really strongly, and how to do that via Zoom. From a theoretical level in a New Zealand context, the high level of internet access, but there's still a digital divide even here, let alone in places overseas, as like Jala was saying, in the Mindanao area. The more we switch engagement to an online space, the more it fuels inequalities. Not everyone has access to the same tools. We've got to be cautious with online engagement. And because maybe it's going to be thinner engagement rather than thicker engagement, that deeper sense of relationships that can be built when you do have face-to-face. I've heard a number of people saying that online is fine as long as you've already met face-to-face and established a relationship. But if you haven't had that, it's really hard to build a genuine relationship. Using Talk Story as a way of collecting research, great. It's all about talking with people. Another challenging thing is making it work for the researcher, but at the same time, not making it extractive. That was a term that Tarsisius used. And trying to value the knowledge, acknowledging the holders of knowledge without just taking out of the community. Fabulous point. Is that the last group? Yes. And so Tarsisius, would you like to make any final reflections on this session, which you kicked off so nicely with your keynote?
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Regina. Not really. I think there are wonderful ideas, things that I didn't think of. I'm really glad that the discussions have gone this direction. And I'm learning heaps actually. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, on that very positive note, thank you all for your contributions to the first part of today's DevNet Symposium. You've got a 20-minute break. We will be starting right on time. And so that means actually you've got a 18-minute break. But hopefully that's enough time to get that much needed bit of a comfort stop, something to drink and eat perhaps, and a bit of a stretch. And we look forward to seeing you back here shortly for the policy and practice session.